The data reflects that investors over the last, I'd have to go back to the exact data, so don't quote me on this, but the latest data I looked at last week, it was sort of over the last sort of 8-9 years, there's been this sort of slow removal from the energy sector and moving down. So, and I'm not saying that's related to the new regulations. There's no question what we should be worried about is anything that is not completed in policy, particularly carrots, positives, creates problems for investors. So it's not just about regulations. Everybody functions differently. So the US has taken a very carrot-based approach. Canada has what I call a blended approach. I think that's a fair, reasonable assessment. Quite a lot of sticks in regulation and some upcoming or already existing carrots. And there are some carrots that are existing. The answer, though, I think in general is it is a problem. Canada is starting broadly to be looked at by investors with some concern. That being said, investors are still in Canada. They still see it as a stable jurisdiction. It has a strong rule of law. And most importantly, for energy development, and this is key for anyone that's sort of in their 20s, quite frankly, resources trump all, and we have some outstanding resources. You cannot beat some of our natural gas resources and some of our oil resources, and also some of our just generally what I'd call ESG record. It's just a reality. Investors, it's pretty hard to go invest in some of these countries like a Venezuela right now compared to Canada. It's not comparable. So you should be concerned, but I don't think it's as, dire as some of us sort of live on a daily basis doing this. You have to follow the data. So. I do. So generally, the first thing you do to get balance in the room is to put a diversity of people in the room. So that's key. So for example, the reality is, look, I'm an oil and gas advocate. I describe myself like that. I also did a doctorate in really strong environmental science. You can imagine spending 4 years grinding through that stuff. You have an interest in the environment. I don't think it is an either or. What I don't think is healthy, though, is if you leave certain groups out, you want to bring all those groups in. And what you'll find is there's actually not as much disagreement on alignment. So the oil and gas business in Canada, I'm not saying this is global, but not only are they genuinely interested in reducing emissions, they have to do it, by the way, for investors. They have to do it for regulation, but they also see it as a positive. It enables them to position the companies better. Where it becomes infeasible and where it becomes difficult is when they're asked to do things that are not technically yet possible. That's hard, and you're still wanting the resource. So the number one thing I think I would say is you have to develop opportunities to put naysayers, yes-sayers in a room together. What you don't want is to make these very difficult, challenging issues for anyone politically to move into political camps. It shouldn't work like that on policy development. There's going to be a lot of bang around in the media. When you get right down to it, you need basically all the various groups to participate as one. And it needs to be a credible group. It doesn't mean everyone's going to agree in the room. They don't. By the way, you'd be surprised on what they agree on. So that's the first step, which I don't think is fully happening, by the way. That's a difficult one to answer, actually. That's a very good question, whoever came up with that. So the answer is both yes and no. So it's going to depend on what the incentive is. So, and when the incentive is. So let's take an example of a very significant incentive that really paid off in this country, not just for one province, but for everyone. And that was former Peter Lougheed, who was a premier in Alberta, and he incented the development back in the 70s of the oil sands. And it has created very, very large revenue for all Canadians. A lot of the wealth that is moving around the country and jobs and different pieces has made a positive contribution. So incentives can play a major role. Where they become a problem, and there have been some governments in Canadian history that have had this problem, is when the government puts in initial incentives on things that are actually long-term not feasible economically. So I'll give you an example. Let's take something that's a renewable. Solar can be an outstanding renewable in certain locations, but I'm pretty sure everyone can figure out solar needs sun. Doesn't work as well in darkness and doesn't work as well, obviously, when there's substantive cloud. You need a lot of sun. So obviously, you don't want to incentivize solar into an area that solar doesn't fit into, as a basic example. So the incentive, it really depends. I actually don't think that's currently occurring that much. I think the bigger question is, where do you, if you're going to put in sticks, where can you also put in carrots to meet the outcome of decarbonization? So let's remember, you're trying to keep the economy in a positive, constructive position, and you're trying to decarbonize, and you're trying to undertake Indigenous reconciliation. You've got to look at the outcomes as you form policy. I think that's been not broadly missed in Canada, but there are opportunities for improvement. That's another good question. It's actually similar to the last one. So there's no question there are, it's a bit hard to answer, actually. I'm not even sure I can fully answer that. There's no question that can occur. So I think, and that was sort of the point of the context. So when you are a group of investors, what do investors not like? They don't like uncertainty. And so, and they're not exactly, each investor isn't looking at everything the same way as every single other investor. They also they don't have the sort of full national context or anything. They tend to be sitting, quite frankly, often in other countries. So I think where you get that is, and the best example would be the emissions cap actually is an example of that. And that's one of the problems. An emissions cap sends the wrong message to investors. It's not impossible to not have investors that you spend a lot of time with and walk through. But the question is, are you really trying to use that from a policy perspective as a positive outcome to reducing GHG emissions and understanding the consequences? Or have you moved into sort of almost narrative? And if you've moved into narrative, you've got to be careful there. So a lot of it is, you can do, I guess the answer would be two things. First, you can use almost like a discount cash flow calculation to just work out the cost. Okay, this is now too expensive. You just run the numbers, just like any of the business students here would do. That'll work, but it doesn't give the additional context. You have to also think of, how would people actually, what signal is it sending to the market? If you're saying, if you put up a sign that says, we don't want to develop asbestos in Canada anymore, guess what? Investors are going to say, okay, you don't want to develop asbestos in Canada anymore. We won't develop it. So you need to be careful if you're trying to actually create a positive outcome and looking at all lenses, or if you're just driving towards one policy line, GHG emissions at all costs. That is a preposterous idea. You cannot do that from an economic standpoint, a cultural standpoint, a societal standpoint, even a social health standpoint, because you're so integrated within an economic system. You have to look at the other variables. That's what good policy does. I believe the media has an extremely strong voice on perception. That was sort of the point of the slide around narrative. How is narrative managed? So I will admit, we're not a narrative-based organization. We're sort of focused on the policy piece, and we, as you could probably sort of see, we try to take a very constructive point of view. And let's remember, we do live in a democracy. So we have to think about, okay, a government, democratically elected governments have certain rights to be able to move forward, even though certain individuals may disagree with them. That's the system we live in, and it's probably the best system that's available. It's pretty horrible in one sense, but it's the best of a whole group of problematic government systems. So, but it is, you want to protect that. So you have to make sure you're understanding that first you have that democratic institution driving this, trying to represent as many Canadians as they can. At the same time, the narrative is very important. Narrative can play, or media can play, a major role in this. And I think the problem with the media now is there's very few reporters actually that will spend the amount of time. There's a few. So for example, there's actually some people in the Globe and Mail that will really spend time grinding down into data and details and asking and taking a really investigative time to learn this. But it is a very important narrative. So no question, part of public policy now, much more than in the past, is about the media component. And it's important if you're doing public policy to consider that. And let me rephrase that. Everybody that does public policy actively, whether you're sitting outside of government like myself or in government, considers that as they make reference to these things. Very important. So how I would do this is, obviously there are various sources out there. Everybody should be looking at the federal government. They have a great website on this, laying out what they're doing. I'm not saying I agree with everything there, but they are trying to make a policy argument in a way that is structured through a normal policy lens. That's positive. So you would want to look there. Then you would also want to look at some of I would personally look at, actually, because you put it through the various lenses. One of the other ones is there's a few cases out there that are quite important to look at. There's the current sort of case on carbon pricing and on C-69, or what they call the Impact Assessment Act, and sort of what arguments are being presented there. And for the non-lawyers, by the way, never get worried about law. Once you read it a couple of times, it's a little bit like reading Shakespeare. It kind of starts to make sense over time. You may have to read the case 2-3 times, but there's nothing overly fancy about this. Go and read some of the cases and go to the start and the bottom of the cases. And you could do it in like 3 minutes. It doesn't take long, but it gives you context. The other one that's out there is, you do want to look in the media and see what narrative is driving this. And you can see the change in narrative. And then finally, what would be a good idea is, and was really what I was trying to get at actually, is what problem is this trying to solve? If you have all of these policies lined up and they're all reducing emissions, and there are as many of them, what is this doing as an outcome? Is this really filling a gap, or what's it trying to achieve? So you would want to ask yourself that question. But I would look at the various lenses. And the final one, actually, I would look at, because it's important, is what does the Indigenous community say on this? And of course, what you'll find is it's not the Indigenous community. There are many different voices, but they're all important voices. So, and then the final one is, you can probably look to some of the main companies and associations for their public comments or their public pieces they've put out on this. But it should actually, there'll be a lot of research and a lot of opportunities. Any of the students here doing, reasonably sensible academic work will be quite successful in finding a lot on this topic. It's a major topic, and you can look at the opposition critics as well, what opposition and what some of the people not in favor of this are saying. That's great. That's a brilliant question, by the way. So the first thing they're looking for is, so let's remember, all business decisions in the end are based on some sort of numeric investment, return on invested capital, basically. So if you've got a marginal dollar, meaning the next marginal unit you're going to invest, where can you maximize your profit for that dollar? That's what everybody would expect you to do. Now, there are then other factors. Again, going back to the investor slide, if you're only a sort of Mr. Burns type character, then you only care about one thing. There are not really many investors out there like that anymore. There are some. And then you move through other lenses, but you still have to have a strong return on invested capital. Then you look to, when you invest in renewables, particularly when a carbon price is operating. The carbon price, because people are trying to avoid that price, which is the whole goal of a carbon price. I'm trying to avoid that price. So I'm going to invest in renewables so I don't have this GHG emission. Okay, makes logical sense in theory. Then what happens is they need stability on that price. So let's take carbon capture, utilization, storage, CCUS. You're not going to get a lot of investment in that until people know the price. The carbon price will not be removed. So if you have one political group saying, I hate carbon pricing, I'm going to take it away if I get into power. And the other group is saying, why is no one investing in new sort of CCUS technology? One of the factors is because there's not stability. So an example of where a government could move is they could put insurance in place on that. It's called contracts for difference. And what you could say is, I'm going to guarantee you, if you need 10 years of stability on this carbon price, then that will give you the 10 years, regardless of the policy changes. And that's what you need. You need stability for investment. It goes back to stability and certainty. And then people do invest in renewables where they make practical sense. It's not an either or. Keep getting in this conversation around, oil and gas is bad or renewables are bad. No, none of these things are bad. Energy is good. We all need energy. What you're looking for is, where does each source have its contributions, and what are the negative components about each source? So solar has its own negatives. Nuclear has its own negatives. Wind has its own negatives. Oil and gas has its own negatives. You're trying to sort of fit it into a bucket, but you will have to make sure, you've got to be careful, and you have to recognize you do need traditional energy sources going forward. There is a bit of a false narrative that next week we're all going to, electrify the entire country. And even then, you have to remember, we don't have a domestic climate problem. We have a global climate problem. So other actors than just, 37, 38 million Canadians have got to play a role, like the other 7 billion people. So it's important to consider all those factors.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tristan. We really appreciate your time and for coming on today to speaking about this really important issue and legislation, or proposed legislation, I should say. That's all from us for you. I'm going to stay on and see if there's any questions about the case comp in particular. But Tristan, yes, we just want to thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to chatting with you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Very nice to see everybody. Take care.
Yeah, so nice to see you too. Take care.
Cheers.
Cheers. And for everyone else attending, keep a lookout for your emails. If you're not on our email list, please make sure you reach out to me if you want to get involved. Lexi at ycresources.ca. And I can send you all the information that's for the case competition. So please reach out if you haven't already. Send me your teams, and everything will be out tomorrow. So I will stick around, see if there's any questions, but if not, thank you so much for joining. Follow us on Instagram and our other platforms, and have an amazing day.